What we've now done is to establish a very powerful analytical framework for analysing the effect that exogenous changes can have on the economy's equilibrium flow of GDP. We've seen how output gaps can emerge, how a fall in exogenous planned aggregate expenditure, for example, can lead to a contractionary output gap. We've even seen how expansionary output gaps might emerge. What I want to focus on for the rest of this lecture is on the government response to all of this. Prior to the publication of the general theory, prior to this way of thinking about the macroeconomy, governments weren't really, it's a bit of a generalisation, but governments weren't really, didn't really see themselves as managers of the macroeconomy in the way that governments now do. One of the significant changes in public policy that the publication of the general theory led to was the taking on by governments all over the world, the taking of the responsibility for managing the macroeconomy, in the first instance to try to avoid events like the Great Depression from ever happening again, but subsequently the phrase often used is fine-tuning the economy to keep the economy as close as possible to its potential GDP. And this framework, this basic Keynesian framework, as simple as it is, has had an enormous influence on the way governments view themselves as managers of the macroeconomy. In particular, the response of so many governments to the events of the global financial crisis can be understood, I think, as very much an application of the sorts of principles that we've been talking about in these lectures. The big fear when the global financial crisis hit was that this would lead to a collapse in planned aggregate expenditure. And what we saw in economies the world over is governments trying very hard to implement measures that would prevent that fall in planned aggregate expenditure from occurring. In other words, trying very hard to prevent equilibrium GDP falling and the creation of large output gaps. And a variety of different techniques were implemented, and we'll start talking about some of those from this lecture going forwards. But what I want you to see is how the analytical framework that we've been developing in some sense provided an intellectual basis for government's response to the global financial crisis. But we'll also talk about some of the difficulties that then created. So let me explain. So here is our contractionary output gap. We know how the economy can get itself into this situation. The first example we looked at was an exogenous fall in planned investment, leading to the attainment of an equilibrium flow of GDP below potential. And we now understand the role that the multiplier plays in this, so that you don't actually need that large change in planned aggregate expenditure or that large a fall in planned injections for something like this to happen. So governments looking at this sort of analysis would reasonably ask, well, is there anything we can do to prevent this from happening? Or if we find ourselves in this situation, how can we get back to potential GDP? And the answer is kind of pretty obvious from the viewpoint of this basic Keynesian model. Think about yourself as a member of the government and think about what can you do as a member of the government to directly impact the economy's equilibrium GDP. One of the things you control is government expenditure. And we've seen how the algebra of the basic Keynesian model provides a direct link between changes in government expenditure and changes in equilibrium GDP. It's the link that's illustrated for you in this formula here. Well, think what that formula is also telling you. Suppose you've got a contractionary output gap, let's call it 100. Well, by how much should you increase government expenditure to remove that contractionary output gap? Now, it's obvious from the logic of the model that increasing government expenditure is a potential means of eliminating the contractionary output gap, because what you would be doing is feeding directly into planned injections and reversing the fall in planned injections that we've seen as a result of that fall in planned investment. So you're a member of the government, you're facing a contractionary output gap, it's been brought about by a fall in one of the components of planned injections, planned investment. How can you offset this? How can you reverse the process? Well, focus on government expenditure, which is the component of planned injections that you directly control. So you're trying to eliminate a contractionary output gap of 100. How much extra government spending do you need? Well, the multiplier tells us you don't need to increase government expenditure by the full 100. And in fact, if we rearrange that formula, it actually provides you with a little bit of guidance. It tells you how much government spending, it tells you by how much you might need to change government expenditure. For example, suppose the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75 and the tax rate is 5%, 0.05. And remember, what you're trying to do is you want to bring about a change in equilibrium GDP of 100. Well, the formula now tells you what you need to do. You need only increase your government expenditure by 28.75. The multiplier will take that change and convert it into a change in equilibrium income that will eliminate the contractionary output gap. In terms of our diagram, suppose the economy was in equilibrium here or here, and we have the contractionary output gap. How can you solve the problem? Boost government spending. By how much? 28.75. That will shift injections up. That will shift planned aggregate expenditure up. That will move the economy to a new equilibrium, an equilibrium that corresponds to potential GDP, an equilibrium where you have removed the contractionary output gap. So the big lesson that a great many policymakers took from this basic Keynesian model was that through clever management of planned aggregate expenditure, and in particular, given that governments have direct control over government expenditure, through managing their government expenditure, but in a proactive way, it might be possible to reverse contractionary output gaps, or even better, if you fear that a contractionary output gap might be emerging, as many governments did when the global financial crisis hit, then an immediate boost to government expenditure might avoid the contractionary output gap altogether. If the problem is planned investment is falling, get in there quickly, increase government spending to offset that fall in planned investment, and maybe you'll avoid the contractionary output gap. This is exactly what governments all over the world did in the wake of the global financial crisis. And what we saw in country after country was a big increase in the size of the budget deficit, brought about to some extent, quite a large extent, by deliberate policies taken to increase government expenditure precisely for the reasons that I've indicated. You can see that pretty clearly in these data, which contrast the budget deficit as proportion of GDP for a variety of countries between 2000 and the sort of the height of concern about the global financial crisis around about 2009. You can see, Greece, Ireland, United Kingdom, United States, Spain, lots and lots of places where we ended up with, incredibly high budget deficits. Not done as an accident, not done because governments weren't trying to achieve outcomes, but actually done quite deliberately as an attempt to maintain the flow of planned aggregate expenditure to try to avoid the contractionary output gap that everybody feared was opening up as a result of the seriousness of the global financial crisis. In economics, there has been a huge debate raging about whether this policy response to the global financial crisis was the appropriate one. Not just economists have been debating this, politicians have been debating this, the general public, I think, has been debating the extent to which the measures that governments took as a response to the global financial crisis, whether these were in fact the correct ones. You can see that these decisions did have an intellectual basis in this basic Keynesian model, but the basic Keynesian model is just that, a model. The real world, we've talked about this before, is much more complex and much more messier. And it's not necessarily the case just because in a nice, neat 45-degree diagram that things seem to work out so well. It's not always the case that translates exactly into real-world policy success. Now, let me stress, the debate on this is far from resolved. There are many economists who think this was the exact right policy response. There are many others who are perhaps less convinced by that. So what I want to do here is just draw your attention to some of the issues that are relevant in this debate. I mentioned before that the basic Keynesian model sort of treats the various components of planned injections as symmetrical in terms of their impact upon gross domestic product. It didn't really matter much which component of planned injections changed. The analysis was the same for each and every one of them. Now that actually misses out at least one important part of the real world, and that is that government expenditure has to be financed. It has to be financed, it has to be paid for in some way. Now, we didn't consider that in our discussion of the effects of an increase in government spending as a means of eliminating contractionary output gap. But this is actually something that governments have to worry about, for fairly obvious reasons, quite seriously. Governments do have to finance their expenditure. Broadly speaking, there are two alternative means of doing that. One is through the raising of taxation, or governments can borrow the money. Now, borrowing the money by the governments means the government doing what is called issuing government bonds or securities. We'll talk more about these in a later lecture, but essentially selling pieces of paper in return for the provision of financing from the private sector. So when governments are considering increasing their expenditure, they may have, and often do, I would like to think, the very best intentions in the world, but they do have to confront the reality that that increase in expenditure has to be financed, and this can be done either through raising the money from taxes or from borrowing that money. There are different types of government spending we also need to keep track of in this discussion. There's government expenditure, which is the national accounts variable, G, that we have essentially been talking about. But there are other forms of government spending as well that if we're talking about financing the government's budget, which is really what we are talking about here, they have to keep, or they have to be very aware of. As well as expenditure, that is expenditure on final goods and services, governments also embark on what are called transfer payments. These are done through the welfare system. Unemployment benefits would be an example of a transfer payment, or an old age pension, or anything like that. But these represent resources that are being transferred by the government and for which financing might be required. I'm going to use the letter Q as my notation for transfer payments. There's a third type of government spending, the interest on the public debt. This relates to the liabilities that governments have accumulated from past borrowing. So I'm going to use the letter B to represent what's known as the stock of public debt. So this is the accumulated debt that the government sector has built up over the years through past borrowing from the private sector. I'm going to put a little T-1 there to indicate that what's relevant at any given point in time is the stock of government debt that has been accumulated up to the beginning of that point in time. So if we take T as our index of a particular point in time, the interest that the government is responsible for in period T is the interest on the stock of debt that it has accumulated up to the end of the immediate past period, period T-1. And I'm going to write little r as the interest rate that is levied on that stock of debt. So the total resources the government has to find to pay its interest bill in any particular time period relates to the stock of debt that the government has carried over from the immediate past period multiplied by the interest rate that is levied on that debt. So we have three different types of government spending, and we have two different ways of financing that spending, either through taxation or borrowing. Let's bring all that information together in an important concept known as the government budget constraint. The government budget constraint simply recognises that the same as households, there is a sense in which governments have to operate within their means. So let me take you through this government budget constraint. Here we have government expenditure, final expenditure on goods and services as recorded in the national accounts. Governments also need to find resources for transfer payments, the social welfare system. The government also needs to find resources to meet its interest obligations, to pay its interest bill. Where does the government find the resources to finance those three spending needs? From taxation, or in any period it can issue some new debt. So there might be a difference between the stock of debt at the end of the period and the stock of debt at the beginning of the period. Or to put it more simply, the government might choose to engage in some further borrowing. If we rearrange that equation, we get the following, where on the left-hand side we have a measure of the government's overall budget position in terms of its spending commitments relative to the income it gets from taxation. And what this tells us is that should the government's spending commitments exceed its taxation, then it really has no other choice but to issue new debt. So that budget deficits, situations where the three spending components are higher than taxation, then the government is going to have to finance that through further borrowing. This is exactly what many governments did to finance their spending initiatives during the global financial crisis. And as a consequence, for many countries, we saw very rapid increases in the ratio of the government's stock of debt, the public debt, to their gross domestic product. There's a lot of discussion about this, both in the context of European countries and the United States as well. You can see some of these debt ratios are quite extraordinary. Japan, well over 200%, Greece, the United States, the United Kingdom, have all accumulated very large stocks of public debt relative to GDP. So that's one of the first things I want to say about the use of government expenditure as a means to eliminate a contractionary output gap. It may work, and the logic of the basic Keynesian model suggests that that is a very real possibility, but it implies a willingness to take on an increased amount of debt. And whether the sorts of levels of debt we're looking at in this chart, 150, 200%, whether those are what are known as sustainable levels of debt, that is, whether there is a real likelihood that sufficient income will be earned in the future to actually pay that debt off, or that is a matter of a great deal of public debate and controversy at the moment. Don't want to get into that controversy in this lecture. What I do want to point out to you, however, is the decision to use government expenditure as a means of fighting a recession carries with it, perhaps, implications for the level of public debt that will then be carried forward into the future.